All right. Good morning, everybody. How we doing? We have winners last night or losers? All right. That's good. That's good. That's good. All right. You amped up? Juiced up? Charged up? Plugged in? All right. As Meryl mentioned, I'm Alex Urist. I lead up business development at XCharge North America. You might have seen a couple of our units just outside the door here. Make sure you say hi to my colleagues on your way out. We've got some great presentations today on the hardware and software track. Really, really important stuff that we got going on here. Interoperability on hardware is a key point. Creating the right stakeholder ecosystems, also a very key point. So without further ado, I want to welcome up Robert Cattile from Simply Fuel Solutions and EJ Ward to give us an intro or bring up the speakers for our next panel, or beginning panel, creating their first draft picks and creating the ultimate stakeholder ecosystem. I think you guys are gonna enjoy this one. So.
Good morning. Thank you for your patience this morning. We had a rush to the gate, so to speak. What we're going to do today is a little different. I'm going to allow each one of the panelists to actually introduce themselves instead of me going through their rather long resumes and expertise in the area. So why don't we kick it off, Rachel, with you, and then we'll just work right down the line.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. I'm sure you had a big night last night. It's still early in Vegas. My name is Rachel Yoka. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at the International Parking and Mobility Institute. You may not have known that there was an association for parking, transportation, and mobility professionals, but I'm here to tell you we're a very large community and we are very excited about what's happening in the EV space. So I spearhead all of our efforts in terms of partnership, building resources for our members and the industry at large. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Alex Argadine. I am the CEO for the Miami Parking Authority. I'm also the chair-elect for IPMI, and I'm happy to be here. We run all the municipal parking for the city of Miami, and we're also the only authority in the state of Florida, which allows us to really work on policy that will impact all the cities throughout the state of Florida. And it's important, especially us being here today, about how the cohesiveness of policy is very important for us to be successful.
Good morning. My name is Greg Brenner, and I'm with WB Engineers. I'm a managing principal, and I lead our technical advisory practice. I've spent 30 years of my career advising and guiding corporate end users in the technical markets to make really good decisions along the way. At WB, we're 12 offices coast to coast. We've been in the EV market since 2016. We have been driving some of the largest networks across the country in North America, having completed over 4,000 charging stalls. We've done the largest EV charging facility in North America. We support our clients with R&D facilities, DC fast charging networks, fleet facilities, and helping them really make good decisions out of the gate.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Charlotte Fagan, and I'm a principal analyst at National Grid in the Clean Energy Development Department. In Clean Energy Development, we sort of have three verticals we think about. We think about overall, we're trying to think about the infrastructure we're going to need in the clean energy transition. So we work in transmission for renewables, energy storage at the transmission level, and then T&D planning for EVs. So we think about where there are going to be really big spot loads of EV charging demand and how can we plan for those and make sure that our grid is ready to handle all of the EVs and chargers that you all are going to put on the network.
Thank you for the introductions. What we're going to do is we're going to toss out a few questions here and let the panelists work their magic on what we put together. One of the first things we're going to talk about is how do you do those draft picks? How do you actually build your foundational pillars to build a good ecosystem, basically the team as shareholders? How do you do that? And the second part of the question would be, who are those from an internal and external standpoint? And how do those stakeholders differ internally and externally inside your organizations and in the industry in general?
I'll
want to start?
be happy to start.
Greg, go for it.
So the way that I would break this down, so first of all, internal stakeholders. Many of our clients are building the plane as they're running down the runway or already in flight. So you really have to look internally, see where your expertise lies. When we're talking about these networks across the country or fleet facilities, there's a lot of things to take into consideration. So once you determine what you can provide internally, you need to look at the ability to holistically roll out the team with external consultants that can provide everything else. A lot of the time, our clients are internally handling site acquisition, they're handling policy and guidelines for their facilities. We're supporting everything from the engineering, of course, but also utility coordination, permitting, AHJ research, all the easements, right, standards, and it takes a lot as you roll out your networks to make sure that you've got everything covered. And because it's such a young industry, you're not going to have everything internal. And the ability to find those folks in this competitive market is really challenging. So seek consultants that can really help round out that team.
How do those internal and external stakeholders differ? And then does any of the other panelists want to build on the answer that Greg gave?
Sure, of course. So at National Grid, as a utility, I think about it in two ways, right? On the internal side, there's the utility relationship with our customers. Utilities, we are regulated monopolies. For a long time, we've really taken customers for granted, right? We sent you a bill, you paid us, and that was basically the extent of how much we've ever had to know about you, was like your address. And in an electrification future, it's really different. And we're finding out how little we know about our customers. And so internally, in our, our internal stakeholders and how we talk about our relationship to our customers is finding out a lot of things about our customers. Someone mentioned on panel yesterday, like utilities don't know where the fleets are in their territory. And that's true. But also I will say nobody knows where the fleets are parked. There's no centralized database that says, here's where every fleet is parked. Registration data does not tell you where that car is parked. So we're trying to figure out where are our customers, where are their vehicles, what kind of vehicles do they have, how many miles a day do those vehicles travel. And so we're really on a journey, and I think a lot of utilities are in terms of learning about our customers, and I'm sure many of you have been on the forefront of that, of having to tell your utility who you are and what you need. But then on the other side, in terms of an external stakeholder system, right, I work a lot on the policy side of this, thinking about kind of what do we need to do from the planning perspective for EVs. And a big part of this is a lot of your state agencies and our federal agencies don't talk to one another because they haven't had to do that before. You know, your DOT has never had to talk to your Department of Energy, right? Like that's why the joint office was created at the federal level, because there's this gaping hole between the Department of Energy and Department of Transportation. We're finding this in the state of New York, that NYSERDA and DOT, they don't talk to one another because they haven't had to in the past. And we found that our role as a utility, you know, we haven't talked to DOT before. We haven't needed to. And so we're finding that we're having to build a whole new stakeholder system for that. Because as we like to say in our group, like relationships are infrastructure. And those relationships are absolutely key to getting infrastructure built. And so those are some of the stakeholders we think about and how we're thinking about new relationships with our customers and new relationships with policymakers that we just simply haven't engaged with before.
Yeah. Rachel?
Yeah, so I'd like to build on that. Thanks, Charlotte. So we know where people are parked most of the time. Whether
I would love that data.
Legal or we're going to talk, Charlotte. We got data for you. But in that same vein, these industries are siloed. Parking and transportation and mobility folks aren't necessarily used to coordinating with your utility. Putting a meter on the street that's wired in is not the same thing. It's not the same demand load. And we have folks who are, you know, it's a money grab. Everybody's trying to put infrastructure in really fast. And people in our industry are surprised when they hear your lead time for your utility could be 18 months, let alone construction, permitting, whoever else knows what, you know, environment you're in. So I think obviously reaching out to the utility first that's our message to our members. So those folks that own, operate, run parking and mobility systems have to know the end user on our side too. We know a little bit more about them than maybe you do on the utility side, but we have so many competing interests, especially at the curb. You've got freight, you've got TNCs, you've got accessible parking spaces, you've got meters, you have all this very busy things happening, plus the streeteries. That level of coordination in every neighborhood is different. Your stakeholder system is different. There are general buckets that you can adhere to, but what does your user actually need? Right? So I don't know that we have great data from a patron perspective on, we have anticipated demand that we're thinking about, but what does the new, not the Tesla who just pulled up out front, the Uber guy, right? Everybody got an Uber Tesla this week, right? Everybody's got a Tesla in Vegas. But what do our actual patrons need and where do they need it to be? So we're trying to bring that conversation, together to find that out.
So I'm your customer, I'm the stakeholder that is typically the last person to get involved in this implementation, and while we should be the first ones at the table. But that typically happens in parking all the time, right? It's your first experience and then your last experience, and then we're somewhere in the middle always and trying to figure out and resolve an issue. So we've had electric chargers in our facilities, I would say, for over probably 10 years. We did it as an amenity, so we put it in. We painted the floor in green, and we didn't even know what EV meant at that time. And then nobody used them, but it was cool because we put them in. But shortly thereafter, you saw that one car that came in, and then they had the Volt come in, and then we had these other. Tesla wasn't even around then. And now what we're seeing is that we started expanding what we had in our facilities. So we do have a lot of data as to who uses it, what is the turnover, how much time. We knew we didn't want to have to pay for the infrastructure because we didn't even know how to manage it. So we did have a company who did the turnkey operation, and so we kind of left it for a while, and we really didn't pay attention to it too much, but we knew we were providing the service. Fast forward probably 5 years ago, we started expanding. EV now became the hot topic. Tesla was already around, and so we started paying attention more to the issue because we are Miami, and Tesla wanted to be right in the heart of it with the fast chargers and take up a bunch of space. And us parking people are very protective of our parking spaces, and so they wanted these superchargers, and we were like, what does that even mean? And so as a customer, we were like, well, is this going to be able to, and as a public entity, is this going to be able to serve everyone? And they were like, no, it's only for superchargers and for the Tesla. And that was a big issue for me. As someone who manages a whole lot of parking in the city of Miami and Miami-Dade County, it had to be something that was equal for everyone. So we went away from that. We stayed with our level 2 chargers. And we have now started converting our parking structures into multi-use structures where we're getting residential units built on top of our parking structures. Before we only had single parking structure, 800 spaces, 400 spaces. Now we are adding 700 units, 1,200 units of living. And these residents have electric vehicles. So now how do we handle that? And so we have I have a data analyst in my office, which we just hired probably 3 years ago, that is really taking a look at a snapshot of when we started to where we are now, so that we can provide and start that conversation with the utility providers. Listen, we need to start figuring out, if I open this grid right now and I start putting these chargers in, are you going to be able to help me keep the power up for this to always function? Now we're also municipal, so the guy next door may not want to put electric charging in their facilities. They might want to use mine. So what does that mean for me? Do I amp up? Do I use more spaces for electric chargers? So as a customer, I think we're very important to have these conversations so that we can pass policy.
And Alex, that's where we come in, right? Because we're helping our clients make smart decisions around the future. I mean, when we were at conferences 2 years ago, we thought we were at the infancy. We're still at the infancy. There's so much that's changing, and you said it, right? This is no longer an amenity, right? It's a need. and it's going to become more and more of a need. So when we talk about stakeholders, we have to work and figure out how to work together and communicate better, speak as one voice. Education is crucial, right? Our team spends a lot of time educating the authorities, the utilities, right, their own clients, site hosts, and folks that are trying to do massive fleet conversions with needs for vehicles that don't necessarily exist yet. But if they wait too long, it's too late, right? You know, they're having vehicles show up and no place to charge them already.
Yeah, and I think, building on that, when we think about the utility timeline, right? I've heard, at least 8-10 times over the last 24 hours, talk to your utility first. The utility is the long pole in this, in your charging development. And obviously, we as utilities, we need to do a lot of work to shorten those interconnection timelines, and we have a lot of work to do and accountability to take for that. But I also think that if we as an industry care about the decarbonization of transportation, we care about rapid deployment of EV chargers, we care that this process where we're in the infancy, right? We're right at the beginning of this hockey stick of growth that we think is coming. We also need to think about, well, what is the long pull for utilities, right? Like why is it that it takes us so long to interconnect your site? And so if anyone was in Theater 2 yesterday, I maybe teased this a little bit, that utility planning is really important, and you all should care a lot about utility planning. Hopefully by the end of today you will. Right, as utilities, our responsibility is to make sure that we get the power to where people need it. However, we're a little bit constrained by how much information we have about our customers. So when we plan our system, we plan for our current load and whatever is in the queue. We can't predict or think further out than that because we have an obligation to you all, our customers, that we only build assets that are used and useful, right? If we build something and no one uses it, that is a failure on our part. But as we are right at the beginning of this hockey stick of growth, we do need to think a little further ahead. We need to think about more than just the customers who are in our queue. We need to think about areas where we're very sure there's going to be big electric loads happening so that we can build that substation that you're going to need ahead of when you've asked us for those 5 megawatts of power. So that way when you do ask us for those 5 megawatts of power, it's 6 months to upgrade your site instead of 4 or 5 years.
Yeah. One of the things that I'd like to pose another question to the panel that builds on top of the long pole in the tent. How important is it to building the team that has expertise or knowledge or use of external consultancies, third-party partners, and so forth? Because are they going to be part of that stacking of poles to be able to complete a successful project? And have you used them before? And how do you recommend that as part of that team building process?
So it's funny you say that because when we first started installing the EV charging station, we have an internal maintenance crew and I have an electrician, and that's how we did it. We saw how much power do we have, how much do we need, and then we'll call the electrician, we'll put it in, we run the cables. It was great. It was like mom and pop shop. We can't do that anymore. Clearly, we have a mandate to put 20% of our new structures have to be EV ready, 20%. So if you do the math, that's quite a bit. We can no longer do that internally. We need to call someone, a company that will help us, figure out, okay, what do you have? This is how much power you got to run, or this is where you have to run it to, and where you're going to put these. By the way, where you are situated is also very important. Wherever you place, the EV charging stations is going to be very important for us as well. So I think we are now in the phase of, okay, who do we call? And this conference, it was funny because I'm like, really, there are companies that really do this? So it's so new to us as well. Yeah. But we're putting a mandate, and we need to start talking to folks like you.
And so, and we have a responsibility to you, our client, to make the right decision, right? When we're analyzing sites, we want to be able to tell you, no, we really shouldn't go here. Like, let's look at the portfolio. Let's look at the best opportunities out of the gate to get you moving forward. And then when we get down to other sites, right, where is that utility connection going to be compared to where the utility has the ability to deliver it. Because if we don't, costs go up, utility durations get longer, and you end up reworking. Take 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. And so we've developed really, really solid processes internally in consulting with our clients that help lead to successful, as fast as we can projects, right? I mean, think about this. A typical DCFC NEVI install, right? They haven't been done yet, but they're going to be, right? So you're talking about, 3 chargers is going to run you in construction 5-7 weeks. The utility acquisition, 5 times that. So pre-planning that in the overall timeline and having folks that have established relationships. We've worked with 110 utilities across the country in over 330 jurisdictions throughout the US, right? Those relationships are there. We're calling on those relationships to help our clients. We had 11 projects kick off the beginning of this week. We already have all the utility site walks scheduled for next week, right? At the beginning of this process, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, it was taking 5 to 7 to 8 weeks just to get a utility site walk to set the path forward. So there's a lot that can be done, and having the right consultants to help guide that makes a big difference.
Yeah, if I might add to that, I think I'm thrilled that you guys have this expertise in the space. We aren't seeing your expertise in our space yet, but we're going to call you. We need you. One of the things that, Alex alluded to in terms of parking as well is that there's an expertise there. So theoretically, any structural engineer could help you design a garage. Any architect could help you design a garage. But a garage is not a building. It is not a condo. It is not a healthcare center. Each of these unique real estate needs have different design aspects in terms of construction. When garage spaces cost anywhere from $20,000 to $50,000 a space, depending on where you are, up, above the ground, below the ground, you need that expertise. You can't just go and start digging in a garage to put in, even if the conduit's already there, just the install of that infrastructure in that garage is very complicated. So to me, the call for expertise not only involves your folks, which we need desperately in terms of planning, but also those engineers, architects that specialize in that building type.
Yeah.
So that you're doing it right, because small mistakes can cost big money.
To put a compilation together for another question here, there was a couple mentions in here about real world. Okay, so now everybody on the panel has spoken about real world versus the artist rendering. So is it important to have someone on your team that has maybe influential contacts, lobbyists, and so forth to get ahead of the curve, so to speak? And would you put somebody like that on your team because the real world may require that versus the artist rendering?
100%, right? I think I mentioned the amount of education that we provide. I mean, years ago, I was going to public hearings because everybody's like, what is this? And at the time, we were talking about it as an amenity. And the questions that I would get from the board, right, the commissioning board or the architectural review board, was, how does it work, right? How do I charge my car? It wasn't about the things that they were responsible for, like zoning, right? It was about how the system works. So that education, helping them understand, makes it easier. We have on our team and are adding more resources to our team in regards to policy, right? So with NEVI funding, there are different things that we have to consider. And if you don't have folks on the team that are aware of those, you're going to be headed in the wrong direction. We have already started to see that a little bit and course correcting with our clients so that they stay aligned and have the ability to take advantage of that 80% funding.
Right.
Yeah, and I'll add to that as someone who thinks a lot about policy on our team. To my point earlier around utility planning and how I hope you all come out of this caring a lot more about utility planning, we're trying to think about what are new ways to do utility planning to help fix some of these timeline issues. You know, if we're at the beginning of the industry and you have an 18-month timeline, imagine what that timeline is going to look like in 3 years if we don't change utility planning. It's not going to get shorter, I can tell you that. And so we're thinking about, okay, how do you plan? How do we, this whole ecosystem of stakeholders, parking authorities, engineers, state agencies, how do we think together about how to plan for that future? And so I encourage you all to look in New York. Some legislation has just been introduced called the Highway and Depot Charging Action Plan. It was introduced by Senator Kennedy and Assemblyman Warner. And what it does is it directs the state of New York to say, okay, do some studies and figure out where are places that we should build ahead of time for charging need for highways and depots. And then it refers it to the Public Utilities Commission to figure out who's going to pay for it and how are we going to do that in a way that's fair to all customers, and then directs utilities to start including that in their capital planning so that we're building ahead so that we can try. I would love to come back to this conference in 5 years and not be the bottleneck. For you all to not say, talk to your utility first, right? Like that someone else can be the bottleneck. That to me is my dream, and I think that for our team and for all of you, really think about how are we doing policy at the state level, at the national level, to help unbottle that. If we're the long pole, how do we fix our long pole so that we can help all of you?
Yeah, from an expertise standpoint, I think there's a value in having someone on your team if you can afford it. But not every, some of our members are very small. They're not going to be able to bring on a data analyst. Miami leads the pack here. You're very, very lucky to be hearing about Miami. They're the most progressive in the country on these things. But if you can't hire internally, our advice to our members is to have a trusted advisor, whether that's a company like yours or a third-party consultant with expertise in the space. What we're finding is that there's so much excitement, and it's a member will call us and say, said EVSE provider called us. They're going to do it all for free. They're going to put it all in. It's going to be amazing. Whatever that scenario looks like. And a lot of our folks are getting information just from suppliers. Suppliers are an excellent source of information. They're amazing. They're experts in their own right, but you need to balance. You got to look at your state legislation. You have to look at your needs. You should be getting information from other sources too. Doesn't need to be IPMI. The Charge Coalition does a beautiful job with this in terms of the legislation and policy. The Electrification Coalition has amazing resources that are all there for free. The Alternative Fuels Data Center. There's no, I can give you a list of 20 different places, acronym city, to follow up on, but you wouldn't just have someone come to your house and say, I'm going to put these solar panels on, and you go, good, you're my guy, right? Without asking those questions. So when you're thinking about a large procurement issue, you should be looking at multiple sources and talking to other stakeholders. Who have you worked with before? Can I talk? If it's Pittsburgh, they're going to call Alex and say, what did you do with this particular RFP, RFQ, or vendor or pilot program? So those connections, I think, are important. There's plenty of research out there and more coming.
Yeah, and Rachel, I think part of the problem is it's technical. So how do you find somebody that can make it simple, right? Engineers, system agnostic, right? Our job is to help compare quantitative, qualitative items and give our clients the choice. Now, the large vendors that we work with, they're doing that behind the scenes. They don't want to roll out solutions that are not reliable, right? Everything's having its glitches. It's a young industry, but the ability to have somebody that can help guide, we're in the midst of building a R&D test facility of our own. We'll have a dozen or so chargers and other products to have our clients be able to come and kick the tires on things. And the larger entities are doing that in their own R&D facilities, but it's just different.
So what I'm hearing from the panel here is that collectively we are the ecosystem. So everybody in this room has a part of that. Some of us are shorter, some of them are longer from the pole standpoint. How does some of this thought process that you've shared with us tie into the NEVI rolling out and how we as a group, everyone in this room, leading to an industry that'll have a successful phase one so we could actually see a phase two down the road? So I'd like you to share some of your thoughts about that.
So I'll start that off. I see a huge challenge with phase one. no disrespect to you and your industry, but I don't know how we're going to spend the money with the backlogs that we have. It's not just utility, it's transformers. It's all the lead time on the procurement of the big electrical equipment that we need to get this work done. And so we have a lot of folks, right? We had, I think, when I talked to Merrill 3 weeks ago, there was 1,100 people signed up. There's 2,700 people here, right? There are a lot of folks that are wanting to help get us there and support with that NEVI funding. But not everybody has been there and done that yet. And so, helping make sure that we can get through that first $5 billion, right, to enable the $2.5 billion is really important for us and important for the communities out there. But I'm concerned with the deadline and the ability to get there and spend that money.
But I also think that it comes from education, and we lack a lot of education, and that's a big problem because the funding comes, and then the state says, "Here's your money," and then what do we do with it? And when are we going to get it? And where are we going to implement it? It has to be the right locations. In Florida, we have hurricanes that threaten us every a couple of times a year, and so we applied for a grant twice, which was we're not equipped to do grants in my office. And I've learned a lot of who does grants here, even among the vendors, which I was very impressed by. And we didn't get the grant, and the grant was for placing EV charging stations on the highway so that if people are evacuating, they could go charge and keep on going. And I thought we did a phenomenal job on putting that together, and we didn't get the grant. And I thought, really, you're not gonna give us the grant twice? I said, fine, it will come. Like if you build it, it will come. Or when the disaster comes, then they'll think about putting it there, which is not the right approach. And so I think education at the higher levels has to come, and I think that is my task with DOT, which I manage all the lots for DOT in the city of Miami and Miami-Dade County. So that falls under my purview. And there's so many of them right underneath the highway that I think, wow, this is such a good opportunity, not only for us, but even for the Amazons, the UPSs of the world, the FedExes of the world to come charge at night. Like we have this whole vision. We worked with Ford for almost 5 years when they were doing AI in Miami. And one of the things that we talked about was, hey, we could provide you charging stations in these vacant lots at night, perfect shared use. And then it didn't go anywhere. And that was one of my projects that I wish wouldn't have failed, because that would have been a good test, beta. So I think educating is the most important for policy, because if not, we're never going to get this moving. And I think it comes from the top.
Yeah, and I think that also even happens between state agencies. For example, we have there's a NEVI site that has been chosen in New York where the Thruway Authority basically said, okay, in order to power that site, because of previous agreements, you have to underground that line under the highway. So it's going to cost $10 million for the upstream upgrades to install 4 chargers. Like, that makes no sense. That that's just not that's not a good solution. It's not cost effective. And so we have these situations where the permitting process, there's these very specific reasons why, okay, can't we just do an overhead line? Could we get an easement to have an overhead line instead of an underground one? Or if we're going to underground this line, which might make sense for this site to serve how many chargers you're going to need there in 2040, 2050, well, then let's underground it once. Instead of spending $10 million to run one conduit this year, and in 2030, dig up that line again to spend $20 million to put in a new one, let's just put in the conduit that makes sense today. And I think, National Grid, we did a study with RMI and CalSTART, an electric highway study. I would love to talk to you about it, looking at 71 sites across New York and Massachusetts, forecasting out what the electric charging demand will be there for light duty and medium and heavy duty vehicles. And what we found is that some of these sites that are currently parking lots, they're parking lots on the side of the highway, are going to need the same electric demand as a stadium, a small town, a factory by 2030, 2040. And, I share a lot of the concerns about how this first round of NEVI funding is going to get rolled out. And I think it's really important for our credibility as an industry to try to, roll out that first phase smoothly. I also think it's important to think not just about this first phase, but how do you make investments today that are still going to be smart in 10 years and 20 years in a fully electrified future?
I mean, think about it. We used to know where those needs would be because you had zoning, right? Zoning dictated where certain things would be, and it still does, but now EV is mixed in with all of that. And so, you're right. We're designing 10 meg sites for EV charging hubs, for fleets, right? The demand on the electrical grid is tremendous. And I think also, and I try not to digress here, Robert, but in partnering, I'm throwing out a charity here. In partnering
Utilities have been punched
with the
quite a few
utilities,
times this
right?
weekend.
We have to remember everything else is happening, right? The aging facilities, some of the processes that you have internally are antiquated. You're trying to recover all those things, and the frequency of natural disasters, every time that happens, our sites across the country take second place, right? The priority is getting the grid back up. And we're seeing more and more and more of that. So we have to figure out how to work together to make the goals that we put upon ourselves.
And that comes to, Alex, your point around hurricanes and resiliency and thinking about, something we think about a lot with big charging infrastructure is where are the most reliable and resilient parts of our system, and how can we make sure that charging is connected to those points so that when there is a disaster, there's a real tragedy in Buffalo earlier this year where people died because they didn't have power. And when we think about an electrified future, what happens in those situations when you have electrified heat, electrified transportation, and people are without power? And so thinking about the resiliency of our system and how do we make sure that we can power vehicles in all situations, whether it's in the south with hurricane evacuations or blizzards in the north, and how do we connect our EV chargers to the most resilient parts of our system, and with batteries to back that up, to make sure that people are able to, with climate change, with increasing disasters, we're going to see a greater and greater need for resiliency for charging.
I think we're getting to the point where we're going to get to ask the audience if they want to pose any questions. Bring it on. Brilliant answers. What I'm hearing here from the panel is there's a lot of work to be done. And I like the inclusive statements that we're all part of the ecosystem. We're part of the problem, but we're also part of the solution. So is there any questions from the audience? Sir.
Yeah, that's us.
For the parking people, parking lot design has long been driven by codes, and they try and squeeze as many in as possible, and so they're all 9 feet wide, or even less sometimes. Should we be looking at 10-foot wide stalls?
So that's a great question. And we're actually looking at working on those codes to make them a lot more flexible with the Institute for Transportation Engineers. So, but I think what you're also looking at is you're preparing not only for an EV future, but an AV future. So those stalls, when there are not humans that need to park the car, and those cars are already there, right? They're being tested at DFW, and NREL's doing work on that. You don't need room to open the door, right? Which means that you may be looking at, and restriping a lot is fairly simple, right? That's kind of an easy fix. Our greater concern is that in the rush to put this stuff in the ground, and I think this is my concern with the NEVI funding too, is that just because you got money for a NEVI charger doesn't mean, or I'm sorry, a high-speed charger doesn't really mean that that suits your need. So I remember when the first EV charger in our little neighborhood came up, it was at Walgreens, and it was a level 1 charger, and I thought, how is that going to help anyone? Because you're in Walgreens for about 8 minutes, maybe 20. And I was thinking, of course, nothing's ever parked at it, ever. Still, 10 years later. So thinking about what's appropriate, and what we're seeing is folks really considering on-street charging at the curb. And we've had a lot of conversations this weekend this is not your best use case scenario. You want to maximize where you're putting your chargers. So just like if you have a bike share, You don't want a bike share on every corner. You want a bike share that's within a nice walking radius, like a first and last mile solution. So if you're putting chargers in, you want Miami to put in a bank of chargers and create a resource for the community. You don't want a charger at every curb, right? But yeah, the street, the stall designs are going to change. All of the garages are going to change as those needs shift and adapt. But we're actually more concerned not with, say, the single occupant vehicle, the single EV driver, than we are with fleets, the Amazons. Where are we going to put those things? You know what I mean in terms of that. But restriping the stall part's pretty easy. Redoing the garage is not.
And when you think about the infrastructure that has to accompany the chargers themselves, the gear, the power distribution, the transformers, and then you're working within zoning constraints for a number of parking spaces for that development, these are challenges that the zoning departments aren't considering, right? If we're taking away parking, we're putting back parking. And there seems to be a disconnect there based on the way we're actually using these facilities and the needs going forward. So those are some of the other things that we need to take into consideration with parking garage.
Agree completely.
efforts.
Apologies to anyone who's a zoning officer, but like the check the box mentality is a little lack of creativity in that space. But one of the things that we'll say is, okay, so let's say we've got real estate developers in the room, right? And let's say you believe that you need 10 chargers for your residential properties, right? We want people to charge at night where they live or nearby, necessarily versus say on the street or whatever. Your parking authority next door, Houston, Miami, Pittsburgh, may be installing a large bank of chargers. Maybe you don't even need to build parking for your development, right? So before you start thinking about building very expensive infrastructure, think about partnering with the large organizations who are going to be doing it anyway. And there's nothing a developer likes to hear more than you don't have to build the parking and you pay in lieu. You do a payment in lieu of parking. Shared parking is a very familiar concept for us, but it should extend to the EV charger as well. Meaning, I live in a building here, I charge at night, I'm going to leave during the day to go to work, and maybe you have a movie theater or a shopping center, and you can have other people use the space as well as the charger. You want to think about maximizing every one of those resources in terms of turnover. So there's a lot, that goes into those best practices, and that's what we're working on now.
Gentleman in the front with the hat, you were first.
This is a utility question. So I've been in stakeholder meetings in the state of Washington, and at one point I asked our utility friends, hey, do you guys have capacity maps so we can know where to look? And I kind of got a deer in the headlights response. How prevalent is that, or are utilities doing that?
Yeah, this is a great question. I'm sure many people are very familiar with capacity maps. It's a real challenge. As Greg alluded to, our internal systems are a little older than you might expect. And so, on the one hand, it depends on the area. Some utilities do have capacity hosting maps. National Grid, we have capacity hosting maps for Massachusetts and New York. Some utilities have really fought that, and that information is not public. I do think there should probably be a more uniform approach to that across the country. The problem with the capacity hosting maps is that it shows you how much capacity is on that line today. It does not tell you how many people are ahead of you in the queue who have already eaten up the rest of that capacity. So something that we're really struggling with in our service territory is that because electricity demand has not been growing very much over the last 20, 30 years because of energy efficiency, we haven't really expanded our system a lot. We've actually maximized our system, so in some ways it's there's not a lot of give left right now. And so what we're finding is that really smart customers, I'm sure many of you in this room who are ahead of the curve on your electrification journey, you've kind of gone around and eaten up what's left of capacity on the system. And so then the next customer who comes around who maybe isn't quite as sophisticated, they get to that line and that line is full, and now the bill they're being given to interconnect is a lot higher than the customer before them. And the interconnection cost is different depending on the utility. So for example, in New York, you don't have to pay for interconnection cost if you're in Con Ed territory downstate. You do have to pay for interconnection cost upstate. And that makes it really confusing for customers. So, the capacity hosting map, National Grid, we do have those, but it doesn't show you who's in the queue, because the problem with who's in the queue is not everyone who's in the queue actually finishes their project. And so it makes it really difficult to give a really straight answer of something that seems like it should be really simple. But I agree that and I'm sure many people in this room would also agree that we probably need a little more transparency on that at a national level.
I think we're getting close to the end of the session, so we have time for one or two more questions. Yes, young lady over here.
Hi, my name is Robin Thome with General Services Administration, and this question is for Rachel and Alex. With the very precise yet strategic method to go through for site selection, how do you balance accessibility issues?
How long do we have? Yeah. So we'll definitely have to
This'll
connect
wrap it
on
up
that.
probably, right?
Yeah, no, I promise this is not about that. But we haven't touched upon transportation equity. We haven't talked about the need to balance the demand for electric vehicles and other electrically powered vehicles, right? Not just the car, with transit, with first and last mile solutions, with fairness to underserved communities. We haven't even touched it. You could do a conference all on that, right? But also in that space are accessibility issues. So the folks who aren't necessarily familiar, if you're talking about a space that might be traditionally called handicapped, we call them accessible spaces. So those accessible spaces have very specific guidelines. Yes, they are frequently abused, and we work on all of that. But now we're waiting for more final guidance to come out of the joint office on what those accessibility guidelines for EVs specifically look like, because those are really important spaces that we need to be, careful to provide. But we're definitely looking for the government to come and help to a degree on that. And of course, we're happy to bring that expertise. But we actually have an organization called the Accessible Parking Coalition. It's about 20 different agencies that represent those folks, different levels of disability and all things, that whether it's visible or invisible. And we're going to be working with them actively to make sure that those guidelines work on our streets, mostly for municipalities. It's a very, very big issue. So more to come.
Yeah, and on top of that, as you work your way across the country, the different jurisdictions are looking at EV facilities differently when they fall within other parking lots. So, getting out ahead of it, figuring out what that AHJ is going to require is tremendous.
Well, that wraps up this session. I want to thank the panelists for their expertise. I wanted to thank all of you out there in the audience for your patience. If you have follow-up questions, catch them outside the arena here. Thank you.